Remedial Succession, Atrocities in Oromia and International Law with Denabo. Denabo is my special guest today. I am Aman Gare. Stay with us. Denabo, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aman. Thank you.
Great. It's good to see you, Denabo. Before we start our discussion, could you please briefly introduce yourself to my English audience?
Thank you, Aman. My name is Denabo Ekawawario. I'm a human rights advocate, and my research also focuses on issues related to global governance and independence movements.
Great, Denabo. Before we start our today's discussion, Remedial Independence, International Law, and Atrocities in Oromia, what are the questions of Oromo struggle, and what is the relation? How could you explain the relationship between the Ethiopian state and the Oromo people?
Thank you, Aman. I don't think the Oromo people are asking anybody any question. Oromo are struggling and fighting to restore what was taken away from this nation. I think it's good to as by way of background to mention the process of the scramble for Africa. That was a period when the European colonial powers sliced up Africa among themselves, and Abyssinia assisted the European colonial establishment in that process. And as a result, Abyssinia received firearms. I'm talking about, practical treaties and what happened on the ground between 1882 and 1909. This is the period within which Ethiopia's current shape boundaries were created. So before that, the Oromo nation was a sovereign, independent nation with its own worldview, with its own system of governance, and in fact, its own democratic system of governance, which the UNESCO registered as intangible heritage of the world in 2016. So during the process of scramble for Africa with the help of the Europeans, Oromo land was invaded and annexed to Ethiopia. And so were other nations such as the Walaita. And so the Oromo values, the Oromo legal system, the Oromo social capital and infrastructure and institutions were destroyed, at least partially destroyed by Ethiopia in the process of annexing the Oromo. So what the Oromo are doing is trying to restore what was taken away from us during the process of the scramble for Africa, and as a result of the fact that the Ethiopia forcefully annexed Oromia and the Oromo. So the Oromo are fighting for what they rightfully deserve. They're not asking anybody any question, and maybe later on we'll get back to it in detail from international human rights point of view, international law point of view, and the global governance point of view.
Excellent, Nasibo. Denabo, I'm sorry. So especially with the new government, Abiy Ahmed regime, why the relationship between Ethiopian state and the Oromo hasn't been improved, especially in the last 4 years?
First of all, we need to really understand the integral elements of what constitutes Ethiopia. The atrocities that are being perpetrated against the Oromo, we're talking about arbitrary mass arrest, arbitrary killing,
and also
eviction, and so on.
Nebo, sorry for interruption. So, for international audience, especially for English speakers who do not understand about the internal political dynamics of
Mm.
Ethiopia, some of them they perceive that the current Abiy Ahmed regime is an Oromo government. So, what would you say on that too, if you want to say something?
Thank you, Aman. Look, the relationship between the Oromo and Ethiopia has always been one of violence. There was no time since 1900, there was no time when Ethiopia has had peaceful relationship with the Oromo, whether we're talking about the period of Haile Selassie or before that, Menelik, the father of Ethiopia, during the communist regime and during the EPRDF or PDO time. And now there have always been violent relationships. The difference now is that the government of Abiy Ahmed has not only exacerbated the atrocities, but also declared to wipe the Oromo out. You know, when they said in the parliament, Abiy Ahmed's colleague Fakadu Tessama in Chafe Oromia, he said, being asked the question, why haven't you been able to contain the movement of the Oromo Liberation Front? In response to that, he said, we have not been able to contain the movement of the Oromo Liberation Front because the Oromo Liberation Front are the Oromo, they are operating within the community. So the only way we can make sure it is contained is word to word, that's what he said. Unless you dry up the sea, you won't be able to get rid of the fish. So what they're doing now, the atrocities, the killings, and all kinds of human rights violations taking place is to silence the Oromos, quest to restore Oromos liberation, Oromos independence. And it doesn't really make a difference whether Abiy Ahmed is an Oromo or others. They are working for the establishment. They are working for Ethiopia. And as for Ethiopia, Ethiopia is a colonial state. Was established during the period of the scramble for Africa, and it has continued. It was, Ethiopia was conceived by violence, born by violence, and has been maintained by violence, regardless of whether the person who is in the palace speaks Afan Oromo or Amharic or Tigrinya. I want to mention this. This is not peculiar to the Oromo during the anti-colonial wars everywhere throughout the world. There were people who were fighting, who were killing their own fellow people in behalf of the colonial establishments. That reminds me of the term askari. Askari is a term used to describe, I think, in Swahili, to describe those Africans in East Africa, particularly, who fought in behalf of the young colonial establishment, and who killed their own fellow members. So, if you see the likes of Idi Amin Dada, those dictators, they were given those kind of military rank by the European colonial armies because they were serving them. So the same goes for Abiy Ahmed or Branu Jula. The fact of the matter here is that Ethiopia is determined to, as they openly declared, to wipe out the Oromo in order to silence the Oromo voice. This Ethiopia is now being led by someone who speaks Afan Oromo, but that doesn't necessarily make the person is working to promote the interest of the Oromo people.
The Nebo, thank you. I remember one of the Amnesty International's report back in 2008, 18. I don't exactly remember the time. One of the report was entitled "Because I Am Oromo." When atrocities, gross human violations are, perpetrated against certain group of people, what would be the last solution? To free this group of people, particularly in the case of Ethiopia and in the case of in Ethiopia, but in Oromia.
Um, I think before you talk about the solution, you have to explore why are things happening the way they are. Why is it that Ethiopia is perpetrating these atrocities against the Oromo? I think the speech of the spokesperson at Chafe Oromia captures, the core of this matter when he said, "We've got to dry up the sea in order to get rid of the fish." That is the reason why they are doing what they're doing. They are trying to silence the Oromo voice. And what is that Oromo voice? The Oromo are claiming, to restore the what was taken away from the Oromo, which is to restore Oromo's freedom and Oromia's independence. And in response to that, even at the risk of violating its own constitution, Ethiopia is determined to using violence as weapon. So the the root of the problem is the fact that Ethiopia has imposed itself on the Oromo. So the solution should be to um, to restore Oromia's independence, whether that is as a remedial solution or whatever you call it, because the relationship that Oromo and Ethiopia have had for the last century and a half is one of violence, one of genocide. So, in order to bring that to an end, and in fact, in order to bring about peace and sustainable development and security in the Horn of Africa, this matter needs to be addressed, and Oromo's independence, Oromia's independence, should be restored. I don't want to use the term secession because it's derogatory. Um, it was Ethiopia that came and imposed itself on the Oromo. Secession should be used to describe some entity that were willingly um, joined together. And like, let me give you the best example where the Scottish independence movement, okay, they never use the term secession, even though Scotland and the rest of the UK had signed agreements, the Act of Union. They never use that term secession. They didn't use it pre um, pre 2014 Scottish independence referendum. Now that is back on the table, they haven't used it, and there are more than 27 movements in Europe with similar goal. They don't use it. Why is it that this term is reserved for Africa? I don't know, but I personally don't like the term secession because Oromo are fighting to restore Oromia's independence and Oromo's sovereignty that had existed before the arrival of the European or before the scramble for Africa. So, in short, the solution is restoring Oromia's independence and Oromo's freedom.
Thank you, Danabo. Especially considering the current situation of Ethiopia, particularly historical, social, economic aspects and geographic locations, as well as several international as well as national issues. Is it practical to especially to advocate for independence of Oromia?
Amal, that's very good question. Um, first of all, there is no law, there is no international law or international norm or practice that prescribes, oh, this nation deserves to be independent and this nation does not deserve to be independent. Um, when we're talking about independence, we are saying a nation is independent when it is recognized as a legal person on international platforms. So the governing norm for that is the United Nations Charter and the international legislations, including the UN resolutions adopted by the United Nations regarding this matter. We're talking about the UN Charter, Article 73, and there are several articles. It recognizes the right to independence for every nation. The key word is a nation. Nation being group of people who, in most cases, share the same language, the same culture, the same psychological makeup, and live in defined territory. So, from that one, the UN Charter adopted in 1948, the starting point, the pillar of the UN Charter was recognizing the independence of nations and independence of people. But when the charter was drafted, the people were not, the term nation and people was not clarified. Was it only referring to those nations under the European colonial establishment or nation as it is? So that's why the UN had to adopt Declaration 1514, Declaration on the Granting of Independence for Colonial Nations. As soon as that declaration was adopted, there were many countries that were granted independence. And further again, the UN, the United Nations General Assembly in 1970, they adopted another resolution, which further clarified that every nation, regardless of who the host state is, regardless of who it is controlled by, every nation is entitled to independence. That followed by two other occasions, decisions of the International Court of Justice brought about the concept of right erga omnes. So from international legal point of view, the right to independence is right erga omnes. That is why, you know, many people say, oh, we are living in the era of globalization. In the era of globalization, the world is coming, shrinking, is coming together. But that is by recognizing the right to independence of countries. That's why, Aman, in 1950, there were only 60 countries, sovereign independent countries around the world. But after those two resolutions I just mentioned to you, and after the International Court of Justice recognized the right to independence as right erga omnes, the number of independent sovereign countries grew more than triple. Now we've got about nearly 200 countries, and there is no criteria to say this nation needs to be independent and that nation needs to be independent in whatsoever. If you see these countries, you've just put it on the screen. These are independent sovereign countries. Okay. If you see the land size and the population of these countries, and if you add all of them together, in terms of both the population and land size, they are less than 10% of the size of Oromia and the size of the Oromo people. So if these are, if they could enjoy, if Malta could enjoy its right to independence, why not Oromia? Oromia is more than 50 times bigger than Malta. The same rules work. Probably Oromo is more unified than those countries, arguably. And if you take Yugoslavia, that disappeared from the world map in 1992. With all the countries within Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia was less than the size of the land, the Oromia, and in terms of population, Yugoslavia's total population was less than the population of the Oromo. So the point I'm trying to make is feasibility of independence is determined by the Oromo people, nobody else. And the Oromo sacrificed, like I mentioned earlier, when Ethiopia invaded Oromo, more than half the population of Oromo died fighting Abyssinia. And the Oromo have already expressed their aspirations by blood. Okay, so now we are living in a completely different world, in a world where the right to independence is recognized, like I said, as right erga omnes. Right erga omnes means right for all and by all. And Oromo are right holder. By that concept, Ethiopia is a duty bearer. If the Oromo people decide today, no, we don't want Ethiopia, if referendum is conducted, ultimately it is going to happen. If the Oromo people decide on referendum saying, no, we don't want Ethiopia, Ethiopia is bound to respect that decision, not just by virtue of Article 39 of Ethiopia's constitution, but by virtue of the fact that Ethiopia is signatory to those international norms and resolutions. So there is no reason why Oromia's independence cannot be restored.
Thank you, Donebo. You was talking about the state that has got their independence. Is this remedial independence? Is this something related to the nature and formation of the states? For example, colonial versus non-colonial states.
Yeah, many of them, by the way, were remedial independence. Now, the problem, particularly when it comes to Africa, is all the boundaries that countries in Africa have got, or the structure of Africa at the moment, is the one left behind by the colonial establishment. In 1960s, the African Union adopted legislation to go ahead with the same colonial structure. The problem with that colonial structure was that those colonial boundaries were created for exploitative purpose and to weaken the African nations. When they merge one nation that is completely different to others in language, in psychological makeup, in every criteria, what will happen is the Africans end up being busy fighting each other, and the Europeans continue to enjoy the flow of resources from Africa to Europe and the Western world. And the good example for this is the relationship between Ethiopia and Oromo. The pillar of the formation of Ethiopia is the concept of the Ge'ez Tabot politics. The Tabot politics of three pillars: the clergy, the soldiers or the fighters, or those people with the muskets. Professor Tashalet Emebu wrote about this extensively in his book, The Making of Modern Ethiopia. He is one of the professors I really respect. He identifies himself as Amhara, but he describes it, to the ground, saying, well, the Tabot Ge'ez politics or the Tabot Ge'ez political system is alien to the Oromo and to others, because in the Oromo, the governing system is the Gada system, and in the Gada federation system, everyone is equal. The Oromo's worldview, Oromo's political structure, Oromo's political institutions and non-political institutions were designed based on the functioning of the Gada system, and that contradicts the Tabot Ge'ez politics, which underpins the formation of Ethiopia. And the Tabot Ge'ez politics was, taken as a constitution. If you read Ethiopia's constitution 1931, which was later revised in 1955. So it has made it irreconcilable for the Oromo structural institutions when compared to the Ge'ez Tabot politics as Professor Tashadet Ababu puts it. So that is why there has, there has always been violent relationship between the Oromo and Ethiopia. That's why um, the solution, the remedy for that is to restore Oromia's independence. In some cases, if you take the former Yugoslavia, the global community worked together and they landed Yugoslavia safely. And there is no entity called Yugoslavia on the world map today. Instead, what we have is those six countries. Those were achieved as remedial independence. Another good example of remedial independence is the independence of South Sudan, which happened, I think, in 2011. If I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong. And Eritrea is another good example of remedial independence. And even when Eritrea became independent, the relationship that Eritrea had with Ethiopia has got more proximity compared to the relationship that Ethiopia has had with Oromo, because everything that Ethiopians boast about is, oh, we've got our own letter, Ethiopia is not colonized, this and that belongs to today, and is in Eritrea. Okay, it's the Aksumite civilization, and others. If you take the Battle of Gundet and Gura and Dagoali, where the black people fought Italy in 19th century, and those areas are now located in Ethiopia. So the point I'm trying to make here, Aman, is countries, states, empires can be born in whatever means, in violent or non-violent. They can grow, they shrink, they can disappear. Nations will always exist. So that's why I believe, based on the practical evidence, that the way out to bring about peace and security and development, not only in Oromia and in Ethiopia, but in the rest part of the Horn of Africa, is supporting countries nations to restore their independence and aspirations.
Thank you. The number one of our audience said that succession is for minorities. If you want to react on that too, I'll give you a chance. Also, especially in the case of Oromo in Oromia, self-independence, does it require the approval of the parent states in Ethiopia? And what does the constitution of Ethiopia says on this?
Okay, thank you, Aman and the viewer. When the viewer said secession is for minorities, I think I partially agree to that. And the reason why I said partially is what is the criteria to say this nation is a minority and that nation is majority? There is no internationally established criteria to say this is minority and this is majority. The good example is, the list of countries we used earlier. If you take, for example, Monaco, or if you add all those countries, 10 of them together, their population or their land size, and sum them up and compare it to the population of Walaita, the population of Walaita is probably bigger, 10 times bigger than the population of those countries. But people say Walaita or Surmi or other nations in southern Ethiopia are considered to be minority, which is wrong. Because a nation of 500,000 people or 2 million people is entitled to the same rights as the nation of 60 million or 70 million people. So to make it short, there is no such thing as minority. And second, secession could apply to, like for example, if Tigray declares independence, which they might, they might do, then that could be taken as secession, because Tigray is the core state of Ethiopia. Then you can call that a secession. And you can also call that a remedial secession, because up until recently, Ethiopia was conducting genocide against Tigray. But when it comes to the Oromo and Oromia, the term secession should not even apply, because the Oromo was a sovereign, independent nation that has got its own language, its own system of governance, its own political, social, and economic institutions. So, it was Ethiopia that came and imposed itself on the Oromo. So what the Oromo are saying is Ethiopia should leave Oromia. I think that was a popular slogan at some point that Jawar Mohammed was popular for. Ethiopia must leave Oromia, and which is right, because it is not Oromia that captured Ethiopia. It was Ethiopia that came and imposed itself on the Oromo, and has continued to impose itself on the Oromo against the constitution, by the way. The constitution of Ethiopia, by the way, it was that constitution that rescued Ethiopia in 1990s. Had it not been for this constitution, Ethiopia's fate would have been similar to the fate of Yugoslavia, or even worse. So I think that it's fair to say the constitution has rescued Ethiopia. Is it mandatory to have the consent of host state? Again, it's not mandatory. Here is the way the international law surrounding this matter works. Every nation is entitled to independence. There is no international law that says, or this nation is not entitled to independence. This nation can join the international community of state, or this cannot join the international community of state. There is no law whatsoever. But the norm, the practice is that if a country, a nation holds referendum, one, if the people decide by referendum, and the constitution of the host state, the main state, has got that provision, then the emerging state will get automatic recognition by the global community of state. Okay, even if the constitution does not allow for that, and there is human rights violations, atrocities, still the international community will accept it. The best example for that is Eritrea. Eritrea's independence was remedial independence. Okay, the Derg constitution did not provide for that, and the transitional period constitution was not a such constitution. So Eritrea's independence was given recognition on the ground that nations and Eritreans had been fighting. So if unilaterally Oromo, the Jafe Oromia, for example, declares unilaterally without referendum, still Oromia's independence will be recognized by the international community because of the provision of Article 39 of the Federal Constitution. But there are multiple layers for the Oromo. One, even if the constitution does not have provision of Article 39, because Ethiopia is conducting atrocities, and Ethiopia has been maintained by the genocide against the Oromo and others, that can be taken as remedial independence.
Great, Daniel. Can you also talk a little bit about the approval of the parent state, especially in the case of Ethiopia, considering the historical, social, economic, as well as, the relationship between one state to others, particularly Oromia is almost share borders with uh, all of the Ethiopian states except, I could say, with Tigray as well. So can you talk about that, to how that, especially the border conflict, with different states, it could be solved.
First of all, let me begin from the sharing border. In this world, there is no single country that is surrounded only by friends, or there is no country that does not share border. And in fact, there are countries located within a city of another country. Vatican, for example. Vatican is an independent country, but where is it located is not only surrounded by different nations, it is surrounded by a city. It is located within a city of a different state. There is no country that is not surrounded by certain by certain different nations. Switzerland, for example, it is almost surrounded by, in all directions. It is similar to the way people want to find. What matters is, from the date Oromia's independence is declared, the relationship between Oromia and the neighboring states is governed by international norms and international laws. And it's not a miracle, okay? Well, when Yugoslavia disappeared, or say the relationship between South Sudan and the neighboring countries is governed not only by the South Sudanese law or that of the surrounding countries. It is what matters is the international law, international norms and practices. That's all I could say about it. With regard to approval of Ethiopia, that again takes me to the concept of erga omnes I mentioned earlier. If, well, it's not if, when Oromia's independence referendum is conducted and the Oromo vote as per the constitution with the required majority, from that moment, Ethiopia is not Ethiopia's willingness. Ethiopia will be obliged to accept it. Ethiopia will be obliged to accept it, not just because this is in line with Article 39 of the Constitution. It is forced to accept it because Ethiopia is signatory to those resolutions and legislations, the UN resolutions and legislations we've spoken about. The legislation 1514, resolution 2625, and Ethiopia's constitution. So by that's where the concept of right erga omnes kicks in. If Ethiopia refuses to accept that, Ethiopia is violating not only the right of the Oromo people, but Ethiopia is violating those international legislations and resolutions.
Thank you, Danebo. Especially when it comes to the international community, one of the biggest concern is territory. Ethiopia is located in the Horn of Africa. It's one of the most fragile region in the world, and one of the concern of the international community, especially when it comes to Ethiopia, is territorial integrity because of the historical location. Several different factors. They want Ethiopia to be an integral state. Considering this or taking this into account, how could you could it be practical, especially to get the recognition of the international community? Does it comes first or does it comes later, especially after self-independence? Which one comes first? Is it the international community's recognition or uh, independence, or
I think what should come
or
first.
is the recognition of the international community, is it the requirement for independence of Oromia or other status in your experience, especially
Yeah,
in other parts of the world?
yeah, I think that's really interesting question. Um, Look, of all the countries that are, by the way, the meaning of independence is when we say a country has become independent, it means that nation has become a legal person, legal entity. It doesn't necessarily mean people will be separated. It doesn't necessarily mean Mount Chilalo moves from one point to another point. It's all about recognizing the people as a legal entity. Of all the countries in the world, more than 75% of these countries become independent as per the legislation we've talked about. For each of these countries, the international community, up until the time they become independent, they might say, oh, we are concerned because this affects the territorial integrity and unity of this country. But from the moment that independent state emerged, America, the US, Russia, they cannot represent by themselves. They are not representative of international community. America works for its own interest. We're talking about the foreign policy of this nation, these countries. America has got interest, Britain has got interest, and Russia and the rest of them have got interest in Ethiopia's unity, because Ethiopia, as it is, does it serve their interest, or bringing Ethiopia to an end will serve our interest? That's how their policy works. But their policy does not substitute the international laws. Cannot become, it's not international law. I'm not suggesting they don't have influence in it, but what matters, what should come first, is the interest of the Oromo people. Because when the Oromo people decide to restore their own independence, then these countries, we're talking about the US, we're talking about Canada, Russia, and or China, they will adjust their interest, their policy towards working with independent Oromia. That's how it works. But now let's talk practically. What is happening on the ground, Aman? Ethiopia is not a stable state at the moment. It is not a finished project. Okay, say where do you locate, where is the boundary of Ethiopia on the west? It's not defined. Okay, it's the same boundary that Emperor Menelik signed with Britain. Okay, that's why Sudan says we have occupied about half of the land that belonged to Sudan, based on the Treaty 1902, by the way. So now Sudan is claiming certain land from Ethiopia. It's always in public news that South Sudan has entered, occupied Ethiopia's territory about 100 kilometers, and in the north it has not been stabilized. So Ethiopia is already a fragile state. So what matters is the determination of the Oromo people. If the Oromo people continue this momentum, and given those legislations and international law, then there is no force that can stop Oromia's independence by them. And the moment the Oromo people declare that independence, these international actors will begin to adjust their policies um, towards, how we work. Okay, China has got lots of factories in Ethiopia, and there are lots of infrastructure. China does not want to lose this investment. Okay, then what the Chinese government tend to do will do is, okay, how can I work with newly emerging state? So to answer the question, what needs to get the priority is the decision, the aspiration of the Oromo people, and the other come gradually. Um, so yeah, I think what matters is Oromo's confidence on themselves,
Thank you,
as
Dan.
it is going to happen anyway.
Thank you, Danabo. With the time we have, I have only one last question. If you want to say something, especially on most of the Oromo political leaders are in prison. So, considering this, who can lead, or take this initiative to lead Oromo people to independence? And also, maybe related to that, how could you evaluate the aspiration of the Oromo people in general, uh, considering the current situation? Considering the current situation, if you want to say something. And also, with the time we have, can you also briefly uh, present us your final remarks?
Sorry, Aman, I didn't catch your last point. I think you got muted.
Yeah, so two
What was the
questions.
last
How
point?
Yeah, two questions. So, how would you evaluate the aspiration of the Oromo people for independence? The second one is, most of the political leaders are in prison. Who
Hmm.
can take this initiative and lead the people to independence?
Well, with regard to the aspiration of the Oromo people, um, the Oromo's aspiration, Oromo's wishes and desires were revealed, um, not just based on assessment or statistics, practically revealed in 19th century. Okay, some people say, "Oh, when did the Oromo say I want independence?" We're talking about situation where more than half the population of Oromo died. And the way that was conducted, um, particularly the brutality um, and the cruelty of Ethiopian forces when they invaded Oromia, is indescribable. I mean, I think Professor Abbas Haji Ganamo has written a lot exhaustively on that, and particularly in his most recent book. If you can, Aman, if you could put on the screen um, the title of that book. And I would encourage everyone to read, the conquest of Menelik. He's written a lot about it. The conquest and resistance in Ethiopian Empire, 1880 to 1974. It, you know, it, it shows the graphic nature of that process, those wars, which claimed the life of more than half the population of the Oromo. So, how else could the Oromo's um, aspirations be revealed more than this? Okay, was there a moment when the Oromo have given consent? Okay, um, when the likes of Abagada Roba Buta, finally decided to surrender, they said, well, we are overpowered because of the assistance Menelik was receiving from the European colonial establishment. So for now, let's wait for our time to come. Our time hasn't come. And our current generation, even Opidio, they say, oh, Ethiopia, Menelik invaded Oromo, and and then, okay, if you recognize Oromia was invaded, then the solution should be restoring Oromia's independence. Look at okay, how do you gauge the feeling of the young people of the Oromo, those in diaspora, for example, in the UK where I live, when in the summer 2020, when they occupied the Ethiopia's embassy, what did they do? They put down flag Ethiopia and replaced it with flag Oromo independence. That shows what happened not only in London, happened in many cities around the world. And the same, young people back home, when they sing Wulabumma, Wulabumma, that shows the aspiration of these people. That is one. And second, there was a glimpse of hope in 2018, for the Oromo Liberation Front to, to move its headquarters from Asmara to Finfinne. There was negotiation to say, oh, you would be allowed to conduct your political program peacefully. And at the heart of the Oromo Liberation Front's political program is Oromo's right to self-determination. The Oromo people have to decide for themselves. When they say the Oromo people have to decide for themselves, as whether to restore Oromia's independence or whether to continue to embrace Ethiopia in Oromia. But what happened to that? The leaders of the Oromo Liberation Front ended up in prison. Ethiopia, Ethiopia ate up its own promises. If Ethiopia was willing to accommodate in peaceful ways, then the leaders of the Oromo Liberation Front shouldn't have been languishing in prison. So who is going to enforce it? Okay, the Oromo young people on whose blood Abiy Ahmed and his thugs walked to the palace in Finfinne. Okay, most of them are in prison, and hundreds, well, thousands of them have joined the Oromo Liberation Army. And again, at the heart of the objective of the Oromo Liberation Army is Oromo's right to self-determination. So because Ethiopia is not programmed to talk peace, then the Oromo Liberation Army is forced to take up gun. And there are many provinces in Oromia under the control of the Oromo Liberation Army 1, and there are some signs or indications that the third party international actors are trying to mediate the negotiation between the Oromo Liberation Army and Ethiopia. Again, this will hopefully culminate. It will culminate in referendum, Oromia's referendum. So, in short, who is going to push for it? Everyone is pushing for it. In my opinion, it's not just only, even though the vast part of that is being handled by the Oromo Liberation Army. This is not something that should be left to the Oromo Liberation Army, and there are many scholars working on that, because this is basic human rights. In order to exercise these basic human rights, people shouldn't be killed. But what is happening is atrocity, and these atrocities have awakened thousands and thousands of Oromo actors. So that is my assessment regarding who is going to lead Oromia's independence.
Thank you, Danabo. Dear our viewers, don't forget to share and subscribe our programs. Thank you for your time, Danabo. We will leave it there. Next time we can continue discussing remedial independence and international law or any other points if you are interested. Thank you for staying with us. That's all for today. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Ahmad.